The buzzards were circling before dawn, broke over the Wyoming plains, their black wings cutting lazy spirals against the blood-red sky of August 1883. 11-year-old Sam Mackenzie crouched by Willow Creek, washing the sleep from his eyes when the sound reached him, a low rattling wheeze that made his spine crawl. Something was dying in the cottonwoods. Sam's bare feet found purchase on the muddy bank as he crept toward the sound. Every story his mother had ever told him about Sioux war parties and scalping knives whispered warnings in his head. But curiosity had always been stronger than caution in the Mackenzie blood. Through the hanging branches, he saw him a man face down in the grass, wearing buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the early light like scattered jewels. An eagle feather hung from graying hair, matted with dried blood, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. The man's eyes opened black as winter nights and fixed on Sam with an intensity that stopped the boy's heart. Neither moved. Then those dark eyes dropped to the red apple in Sam's hand, his only breakfast, until evening chores were done. Without thought, without understanding why, Sam stepped forward and placed the apple beside the stranger's outstretched fingers. The wounded man, clearly a chief by his bearing. And Regalia closed his eyes and whispered something in a language Sam didn't know. But the gratitude needed no translation. The chief's hand closed around the apple with surprising strength, and he managed to lift his head enough to look directly into Sam's eyes. What passed between them in that moment transcended words, a recognition of shared humanity that would soon set in motion events neither could imagine. Sam turned and ran crashing through the underbrush toward home. The image of those grateful eyes burned into his memory. He had no way of knowing that his single act of kindness had just lit the fuse on a powder keg that would tear his world apart and force him to discover what true courage really meant. Behind him, Chief Wicasa took a small bite of the apple and smiled despite his pain. The boy had given him more than food, he had given him hope that perhaps his final mission was not doomed after all. Clara Mackenzie stood at her kitchen window, flour dusting her hands, as she watched dust devils dance across the endless prairie. At 32, she possessed the weathered strength of a woman who had learned to shoulder burdens meant for two. Her husband's death in the copper mines 3 years past had left her with a homestead to run a boy to raise, and secrets that grew heavier with each passing season. The cabin was small but spotless, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and medical supplies arranged in neat rows, remnants of her nursing days back in Ohio, before Wyoming territory had claimed her heart and nearly broken it. She had come west seeking a new life, but found instead that some shadows were too long to outrun. Sam's late again. She murmured, then caught sight of her son racing across the yard like something was chasing him. His wild eyes and muddy feet told a story she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "And what's gotten into you, boy?" "Nothing, Ma. Just thought I saw wolf tracks by the creek. Big ones." Clara studied his face. Sam had inherited his father's complete inability to lie convincingly, but Wyoming had taught her when to push and when to let sleeping dogs lie. "Get cleaned up. We're riding to town for supplies." The journey to Bitter Creek took them past the Dumont place where Marie waved from her vegetable garden. Marie was Métis French fur trapper and Cree Indian blood mixing to create a woman who belonged fully to neither world, but had made peace with both. Her husband Pierre worked odd jobs around the territory, and their quiet acceptance of the Mackenzies' solitary ways had grown into something approaching friendship. Bitter Creek sprawled across the plains like scattered bones, its false-fronted buildings lined up along Main Street, with the desperate optimism of a community determined to civilize the wilderness through sheer stubbornness. The general store, saloon, sheriff's office, and hotel formed the heart of the settlement, while the white-steepled church stood at the far end like a finger pointing toward heaven, though most folks figured heaven was a considerable distance from Wyoming. Sheriff Tom Brennan held court on the porch of his office, his impressive bulk filling a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. At 45, he carried himself with the authority of a man who had carved out his position through a combination of political cunning and carefully applied violence. His deputy, Jake Morrison, cleaned his fingernails with a knife blade, his nervous energy at odds with his boss's calculated stillness. "Morning, Mrs. Mackenzie." Brennan called as their wagon passed. "Hope you're keeping that boy close to home. Been some unusual tracks spotted around the creek lately." Clara's grip tightened on the reins. "We mind our own business, Sheriff. Wise policy. Long as everyone remembers which business belongs to who." At Voss's general store, Clara purchased flour salt and ammunition, while Sam fidgeted nearby, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting trouble. Harold Voss was a thin man with suspicious eyes who treated every transaction like a potential swindle. "He heard tell there's been Indian sign east of town," Voss said, counting out Clara's change twice. "Tracks leading toward the old winter camp. Could be that troublemaker Wicasa stirring up the young bucks again." "Wicasa means wise man in Lakota," said a quiet voice from the store's shadowed corner. Everyone turned. Marie Dumont stepped into the light, her dark eyes meeting Clara's, with an expression that seemed to carry multiple meanings. "You speak their heathen tongue." Deputy Morrison had followed them into the store, his hand resting on his gun butt with practiced casualness. "I speak many tongues," Marie replied evenly. "It's useful for understanding one's neighbors." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Sam pressed closer to his mother, his young instincts sensing danger even if he couldn't name its source. "Come on, Sam," Clara said. "We have what we need." As they loaded their supplies, Marie appeared beside them with the ghostly silence of someone who had learned early to move without drawing attention. "Be careful, Clara," she whispered urgently. "There are old debts coming due, things that should have stayed buried." "What kind of debts?" But Marie had already melted back into the crowd, leaving Clara with questions that felt dangerous to even think about. That evening, as Sam helped with chores, she found herself studying his face in the lamplight, seeing his father's stubborn jaw, and wondering what kind of world she was preparing him to inherit. From the trunk beneath her bed, she retrieved a leather-bound journal she hadn't touched in 5 years. Its pages contained her careful handwriting, documenting events that had driven her from her old life to this remote corner of Wyoming, events that still visited her dreams with regularity. The journal fell open to a page dated December 1878, and Clara's hands trembled as she read her own words describing that terrible winter when everything had gone wrong. She closed the book quickly, but the damage was done. The memories were stirring, and with them came the certainty that the peaceful life she had built was about to crumble. Outside night settled over the prairie like a dark blanket, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, or perhaps it was something else entirely. The pounding on the door came at dawn, sharp and insistent as gunfire. Clara jolted awake to find Sam already at the window, his face pressed against the glass with the intensity of a boy who had learned to read trouble in the set of men's shoulders. "Ma, there's a lot of them, all armed." Clara threw on her dress and boots, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Brennan leading a mounted posse toward their cabin, dust rising from the horses' hooves like smoke from a prairie fire. "Sam, get to the root cellar and stay there until I call for you." "But Ma..." Now, the boy vanished through the kitchen door as the riders surrounded the cabin with military precision. Clara stepped onto her porch, keeping her hands visible and her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Sheriff Brennan, early for a social call." Brennan dismounted with deliberate slowness, his pale eyes fixed on her face. Behind him, she recognized several townsmen Voss from the store, 2 ranch hands from the Morrison spread, and a man she didn't know, someone with the hard-eyed look of a professional gunfighter. "This isn't social, Mrs. Mackenzie. Tommy Eckhart saw your boy down by the creek yesterday morning. Says he was feeding an Indian." Clara's blood turned to ice. Tommy Eckhart was a 16-year-old ranch hand with more mouth than sense. But if he'd seen Sam, Tommy Eckhart sees pink elephants after a night in town. "We found sign, Mrs. Mackenzie." Moccasin tracks, blood trail evidence of someone hiding in the cottonwoods. Brennan's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Question is, where's the Indian now? Before Clara could respond, one of the men emerged from searching the barn, dragging Sam by the arm. The boy's face was pale, but defiant, his jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had gotten his father into trouble more times than Clara could count. "Found him hiding behind the grain sacks," the man announced. Brennan loomed over Sam, his shadow falling across the boy like a threat. "Son, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want truthful answers. You understand?" Sam nodded, glancing at his mother before meeting the sheriff's gaze. "Did you see an Indian by the creek yesterday?" The silence stretched like a held breath. Clara willed her son to lie, to deny everything. But she had raised him to tell the truth, and Sam had inherited his father's stubborn honesty along with his jaw. "Yes, sir." The admission hit Clara like a physical blow. Around the yard, the mounted men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. "What did you do when you saw him?" "He was hurt real bad, bleeding. I gave him my apple." A murmur ran through the posse, and Clara heard someone spit in disgust. The unknown gunfighter laughed harshly. "Feeding the enemy, boy, that's close to treason in my book." "He wasn't an enemy," Sam said with the clear logic of childhood. "He was just hurt." Brennan's face darkened. "Mrs. Mackenzie, you and your boy are coming to town with us. For your own protection, you understand." "That's not necessary." "It's not a request." Brennan's hand rested on his gun butt. "You've compromised the safety of this entire community. Until we know what we're dealing with, you're both under protective custody." As Clara packed a small bag with trembling hands, she could hear the men outside talking in low voices about tracking parties and what they'd do when they found the wounded Indian. What she couldn't hear was the soft sound of moccasined feet moving through the tall grass a half-mile away, where Marie Dumont knelt beside a wounded Sioux chief, whispering urgent warnings in his ear. "They're coming for you," Marie said in careful Lakota. "The boy who helped you, they have him." Chief Wikasa's eyes fluttered open, dark with pain, but alert. "The child, he must not suffer for his kindness. My husband has gone to bring word to your people. Help is coming." Wikasa struggled to sit up, his weathered hand closing around the core of Sam's apple. "Tell me about this boy. What is his name?" "Sam Mackenzie, 11 years old. His mother was a healer in the Eastern Territories." Something flickered in the chief's expression, recognition perhaps, or memory. "Mackenzie." "Clara Mackenzie." Marie nodded, surprised. "You know her?" "I know of her. She tended our wounded after the winter of blood. She spoke truth when others spoke lies." Wikasa's voice grew stronger with determination. "The debt must be repaid. The child must not suffer for honoring the old ways." As the posse rode away from the Mackenzie homestead with their prisoners, neither Clara nor Sam could see what was happening on the distant ridge, where smoke signals began to rise like prayers against the morning sky. Signals that would bring help, but also bring a reckoning 5 years overdue. The jail in Bitter Creek consisted of 2 cells that smelled of desperation and broken dreams. Clara and Sam weren't locked behind bars, not yet. But Sheriff Brennan had made it clear they weren't free to leave either. "For your own safety," he'd said, though the armed guards who took shifts watching them suggested otherwise. From the single window, Clara could see Main Street bustling with unusual activity. Men she didn't recognize had ridden in from neighboring ranches, drawn by word of Indian trouble like vultures to carry on. They gathered outside the saloon, their voices carrying fragments of conversation that chilled her blood. Should have dealt with them savages years ago. You can't trust a single one of them red devils. Time to teach them what happens when they mess with white folks. Sam sat on the narrow cot pretending to read, while his attention drifted to the angry voices outside. At 11, he was old enough to understand hatred, even when he couldn't comprehend its source. He said quietly, "Did I do something wrong?" Clara sat beside him, choosing her words carefully. You did what your heart told you to do, Sam. Sometimes that's the only way to live with yourself. But everyone's angry. People are scared. And scared people don't always think clearly. Through the walls, they could hear Sheriff Brennan organizing search parties in the main office. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But Clara detected an undercurrent of uncertainty beneath the bluster. "I want teams of 6, Brennan was saying. "Check every canyon, every cave, every stand of trees between here and the reservation. That Indian's wounded and desperate could be anywhere." Deputy Morrison's nasal voice chimed in. "What if he made it back to his people? What if they're planning something? Then we have bigger problems. Last thing we need is a war party thinking we mistreated their precious chief." Clara's blood chilled at the casual way they discussed violence, as if human lives were poker chips to be wagered. She pressed her ear closer to the wall, trying to catch more of the conversation. "Maybe we should contact Fort Laramie," suggested another voice. "Get some cavalry support. And have the army asking questions, no thank you. We handle this ourselves quiet-like." The discussion moved away from the door, but Clara had heard enough. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control, and she and Sam were trapped at its center. That afternoon, Deputy Morrison brought them water and stale bread, his nervous energy filling the small space like smoke. He was a thin man with the shifty eyes of someone who enjoyed having power over people who couldn't fight back. And a word is that Indian you helped was painted for war. Morrison said setting the tin cups just within their reach. War, lance, scalping knife, the whole heathen arsenal. "Who told you that?" Clara asked. "Folks who know about these things. Tommy Eckhart got a good look before he hightailed it back to town." Clara suspected Tommy Eckhart's story had grown considerably in the telling, but arguing would only make things worse. "A wounded man seeking help isn't the same as a war party," she said. Morrison's laugh held no humor. "You're mighty naive for someone who's lived out here as long as you have Mrs. Mackenzie. Indians are Indians. Show them mercy, they'll repay it with a tomahawk to the skull." After Morrison left, Clara found herself pacing the small space like a caged animal. The afternoon sun slanted through the barred window, and she could see the shadows growing longer. Soon it would be dark, and darkness brought its own dangers. A commotion in the street caught her attention. A rider was galloping into town, his horse lathered with sweat, shouting something that made the gathered men reach for their weapons. Sheriff Brennan burst through the office door, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Well, Mrs. Mackenzie, looks like your Indian friend isn't as alone as we thought. Charlie Morse just rode in from his ranch, says he spotted smoke signals coming from Devil's Ridge. Looks like your little act of charity might have started a war." Clara's heart sank. Smoke signals could mean anything, but in the current atmosphere, they would be interpreted as a threat. "Sheriff," she said, keeping her voice calm. "You don't know that those signals have anything to do with—" "I know enough." Brennan's hand rested on his gun. "Got women and children in this town, Mrs. Mackenzie? I won't see them butchered because you decided to play nursemaid to a savage." Before Clara could respond, another man appeared in the doorway, someone she hadn't seen before, but whose resemblance to the sheriff was unmistakable. This had to be David Brennan, Tom's younger brother, though he looked like he'd aged a decade in the past few years. "Tom," David said quietly, "maybe we should think about this. Send a messenger to the reservation, see if we can, negotiate, apologize." Tom's voice rose dangerously. "We tried being reasonable with Indians before David. Remember how that turned out?" The brothers stared at each other across the small office, and Clara sensed currents of old conflict running between them. David's eyes held something that looked like desperation, while Tom's burned with the certainty of a man who had made his choices and would not be swayed. "Lock them up properly," Tom ordered Morrison. "Post guards on both doors. If this turns into a siege, these two might be valuable bargaining chips. As the cell door clanged shut with finality, Clara realized that her attempts to protect Sam by staying quiet had only made things worse. The truth was buried 5 years deep and stained with blood that had never washed clean. But it was fighting its way to the surface, whether she wanted it to or not. Outside, the first campfires began to appear on the ridge like fallen stars, and Clara knew that whatever was coming would test them all in ways they couldn't imagine. The first arrows struck at midnight, their iron points biting deep into the wooden walls of Bitter Creek's buildings, with sounds like angry wasps. Clara jerked awake to find Sam already at the cell window, his young face illuminated by the orange glow of fires that had appeared on the surrounding ridges. Ma, they're everywhere. Clara joined him at the bars, her heart pounding as she counted the campfires. They formed a complete circle around the town, close enough to be clearly visible, but far enough to avoid rifle range. It was a classic siege formation, executed with military precision. 40, maybe 50 fires, she whispered. That's not a raiding party, that's a war band. Sheriff Brennan burst into the jail fully armed, and followed by several men Clara didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals who carried themselves like professional gunfighters. The smell of gunpowder and fear clung to them like smoke. "Well, Mrs. Mackenzie, your Indian friends have come calling," Brennan announced grimly. "Whole damn tribes out there by the look of it. Question is, what do they want?" Before Clara could answer, another flight of arrows hissed through the air, followed by the distinctive war cries of Sioux warriors. The sounds were designed to terrorize, and they were working. Through the walls, she could hear women screaming and children crying as the town transformed into a fortress. Deputy Morrison appeared with 2 other men and the professional gunfighters she'd noticed earlier. One was tall and silver-haired with cold blue eyes, while the other was shorter and stockier, with Confederate cavalry insignia on his hat. "Brought some experienced help," Morrison announced. "Mr. Keller and Mr. Wade have dealt with Indian troubles before." Keller studied Clara and Sam with the calculating gaze of a predator. "These the ones who started all this. Boy fed a wounded Indian," Brennan explained. "Could be they're part of some larger plan." Wade spat tobacco juice on the floor. "Best thing would be to hand them over. Let the savages have what they came for. Might prevent a massacre." "No." The voice came from the doorway, quiet, but carrying absolute authority. David Brennan stepped into the lamplight, and Clara was shocked by his appearance. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, and his hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "We don't hand over civilians," David continued. "I don't care what they might have done." Tom Brennan's face darkened. "David, this isn't the time for your conscience to start bothering you. We've got a whole town to protect. I know exactly what we need to protect." David's voice carried an intensity that made everyone pause. "And I know what happens when we start making decisions based on fear instead of facts." The brothers locked eyes, and Clara sensed years of unspoken conflict crackling between them. Whatever had happened in their past was still eating at David's soul. Before either could speak again, a new sound cut through the night air, the rhythmic beating of drums, accompanied by chanting voices that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The sound was primal haunting, and it made every man in the room check his weapons. "The war drums," Wade said grimly. "They're working themselves up for an attack." But Clara was listening more carefully, her nursing experience having taught her to hear what others missed. "Those aren't war drums," she said slowly. "That's a death chant. They're mourning someone." As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared in the doorway. A young Indian man who had moved through the town's defenses like smoke. He wore traditional buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork and carried a modern rifle with casual competence. "My name is Tall Bear," he announced in careful English. "I come to speak for my people." Morrison's hand dropped to his gun, but Tall Bear made no threatening moves. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in Clara and Sam behind bars, the armed men, the barely controlled panic that filled the air. "You hold prisoners," Tall Bear said. "We wish to speak with them." "Like hell," Morrison snarled. "You can speak to my rifle, boy." Tall Bear's gaze shifted to the deputy, and something dangerous flickered in his expression. "My uncle lies dead because of white man's bullets. The woman and child showed him kindness in his final hours. We remember such things." Clara's breath caught. "Wicasa was your uncle." Tall Bear nodded gravely. "He was war chief of our band. He came seeking understanding, hoping to prevent the troubles that are coming. Instead, he found treachery and death. He came armed," Brennan protested, "carrying weapons. He carried his lance because it was his right, his honor. But he came alone, seeking to speak with the leaders of this place about the old wrongs that poison the ground between our peoples." "What old wrongs?" David asked quietly. Tall Bear's expression grew terrible in its controlled fury. "The winter of blood. When white men came in the darkness and murdered our innocents while they slept. 17 souls crying for justice, including my grandmother and 2 small cousins." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, and with them came a sick certainty about what she was about to hear. "That was 5 years ago," Tom Brennan said carefully. "Ancient history. Not ancient to those who remember. Not ancient to the children who still cry in the night, dreaming of their murdered families." Tall Bear's voice remained steady, but Clara could see the effort it cost him. "My uncle came to speak of these things, to find a path that would not require more blood. Instead, someone shot him like a rabid dog." Clara was watching David Brennan's face, and what she saw there confirmed her worst fears. Guilt. Raw, terrible guilt, mixed with a recognition that went deeper than simple sympathy. "David," she said quietly, "you know about this winter massacre. You were there." David's cigarette trembled between his fingers. His brother Tom was staring at him now, warning signals flashing in his eyes. "David." Tom's voice carried a clear threat. "What is she talking about?" But before David could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted outside. Not the random shots of nervous guards, but the coordinated volleys of an organized assault. The Sioux warriors were moving, and Bitter Creek's defenses were being tested in deadly earnest. "Too late for talking," Wade announced, checking his weapons. "Time to ford up and see how many of the bastards we can take with us." But Clara wasn't looking at the gunfighter. She was watching the interplay between the Brennan brothers, seeing the weight of shared secrets and divergent consciences. The truth about the winter massacre was fighting its way to the surface, and when it emerged, everything would change. Outside, the war cries grew louder, but Clara realized that the real battle was about to be fought right here in this room, between truth and lies, justice, and cover up the weight of the past and the hope of the future. The siege of Bitter Creek had begun, but the most important war would be fought in the hearts and minds of those who had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. The attack came from all directions at once, but it wasn't the overwhelming assault Sheriff Brennan had expected. Instead of waves of shrieking warriors, the Sioux moved like ghosts through the darkness, striking at specific targets before melting back into the night. "They're not trying to overrun us," Clara realized, watching the tactical precision of the assault. "They're trying to force us into something specific." Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, she noticed that the attacks were concentrating on the jail and the sheriff's office, as if the warriors knew exactly where to find what they were looking for. Sheriff Brennan was barking orders to his men when David suddenly stepped forward, his face pale with decision. "Tom, we need to talk, right now before this goes any further. We need to defend the town, not have family conversations. The town's in danger because of what we did 5 years ago." David said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Because of the lies we've been living with." Before Tom could respond, The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced another arrival. Through the window, Clara could see Marie Dumont riding hard toward the jail, her dark hair streaming behind her as she pushed her horse through the scattered gunfire. "Let me in," Marie called, pulling up in a cloud of dust. "I have something Sheriff Brennan needs to see." Morrison hesitated, but the urgency in Marie's voice convinced him to unlock the door. She stumbled inside, breathing hard, clutching something wrapped in oiled cloth. "Marie," Clara called from behind the bars. "What's happening out there?" "More than anyone knows." Marie gasped, unwrapping her bundle to reveal a familiar, leather-bound journal. Clara's heart stopped as she recognized her own handwriting on the cover. "Where did you get that?" Clara whispered. "From David Brennan. He rode out to where we were hiding. Chief Wicasa pressed this into my hands before his uncle died. Said it was time for the truth to come out." Morrison stepped forward suspiciously. "What truth? What's in that book?" Marie opened the journal, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "The record of the winter, when Clara Mackenzie served as field nurse for a territorial survey expedition. The winter when 17 Sioux civilians were murdered in their sleep." Clara's vision blurred as memories she'd buried came flooding back. The expedition to map potential railroad routes, the growing tension with local tribes, the gradual corruption of what should have been a peaceful, scientific mission. "Read it," Clara said quietly. "They deserve to know." Marie found the relevant passage and began to read in her clear voice. December 20th, 1878. "The situation has deteriorated badly. Captain Morrison has been drinking heavily and making threats against the Indian winter camp. David Brennan came to me in distress, saying his brother Tom and Morrison are planning a raid. I told him he must be mistaken, but his certainty terrifies me." Morrison's face went white. "Morrison, that was my father's name," Marie continued. December 22nd. "God help us all. They did it. Morrison, Tom Brennan, and 6 others attacked the camp at dawn. But it wasn't a warrior camp. It was families wintering in a sheltered valley. They killed 17 people. Grandmothers, mothers, children barely old enough to walk. The silence in the jail was absolute. Even the gunfire outside seemed to pause as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. I treated the survivors as best I could." Marie read on, but most of the wounds were clearly execution style. "This wasn't a battle, it was a calculated massacre. David Brennan wept as he helped me carry the bodies. He keeps saying he should have warned them somehow." Morrison sank into a chair, his face gray with shock. "My father never said. He told me he'd fought hostile Indians, done his duty for the territory." "Uncle, there's more," Marie said grimly, turning to another page. January 3rd, 1879. The survivors reached the main band and told their story. A war chief named Wicasa has sworn vengeance against those responsible. But the territorial authorities are covering it up, calling it a defensive action against hostile forces. The railroad company is paying substantial sums to ensure the truth never comes out officially. Clara closed her eyes, remembering the impossible weight of keeping such a secret. She documented everything with the intention of seeking justice. But then the cover-up had begun, and she'd realized that the truth would only get her killed. "That's why you came to Wyoming," Sam said quietly. "You were running from this." Clara nodded. "I couldn't stay in Montana knowing what I'd witnessed, couldn't pretend it never happened." But as the implications of the journal's contents sank in, Clara realized there was something else, something even more devastating than the massacre itself. "Marie," she said slowly, "how did David know where you were hiding, Wicasa? How did he know to bring you the journal at exactly the right time?" Marie's face went pale as she understood what Clara was asking. He said he'd been watching, waiting for the right moment to make things right." "Watching from where?" Clara pressed. "How long had he been watching?" The answer came not from Marie, but from Tall Bear, who had been listening with growing tension. My uncle was shot by someone who knew exactly where to find him. Someone who knew his habits, his roots, his hiding places. All eyes turned to David Brennan, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. Tom was staring at his brother with dawning horror. "Been honored," Tom said quietly. "What did you do?" David's hands shook as he lit another cigarette, his whole body trembling with the weight of truth he could no longer carry alone. "I've been meeting with Wicasa for months. Secretly. He was trying to find a peaceful way to get justice for the massacre, and I wanted to help him, to make amends for not stopping it in the first place." "You've been meeting with him?" Tom's voice rose dangerously. "You've been consorting with the enemy." "He wasn't the enemy," David exploded. "He was trying to prevent exactly what's happening now, a war that will kill innocent people on both sides." Clara felt another piece of the puzzle click into place, and this one made her blood freeze. "David, when you met with Wicasa yesterday morning, were you alone?" David's silence was answer enough. "Someone followed you." Clara continued. "Someone who knew about your meetings and decided to end them permanently." Tom Brennan's face had gone through several expressions, shock, fear, and now a cold calculation that made Clara's skin crawl. "David, you fool. Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've put at risk?" "I was trying to find a peaceful solution." "You were jeopardizing everything," Tom snarled. "My career, my reputation, the stability of this entire territory. Did you think the railroad company would just stand by and let their investment be threatened by your guilty conscience?" The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Clara realized with growing horror that the massacre 5 years ago had been just the beginning, that there were forces at work willing to kill again, to keep their secrets buried. "Tom," she said quietly, "who else knows about David's meetings with Wicasa?" Tom's hand moved to his gun, and Clara saw the exact moment when he realized that too much truth had already come out. The situation had spiraled beyond his control, and desperate men made desperate choices. Outside, the war cries were growing louder, more insistent. The Sioux warriors were closing in, seeking justice for their murdered chief and the massacre that had preceded his death. But the real battle was about to be fought right here in this room, between brothers whose divergent paths had led them to this moment of reckoning. The truth was out. But Clara realized with sickening certainty that knowing the truth and surviving to act on it were two very different things. Tom Brennan's gun was halfway out of its holster when the building shook under the impact of a dozen arrows, striking the walls in perfect unison. The sound was like hail on a tin roof, but infinitely more menacing. "They're moving closer," Wade announced from the window. "Looks like they're done playing games." Through the glass, Clara could see Sioux warriors advancing through the streets of Bitter Creek, using abandoned buildings for cover as they tightened their circle around the jail. Their movement was coordinated, professional. This wasn't the wild charge of angry savages that the townspeople had expected, but the methodical advance of experienced fighters with a specific objective. "Tom," David said urgently, his eyes on his brother's weapon, "we can still end this peacefully. Let me talk to them. Let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been meeting secretly with their war chief? That you've betrayed your own people?" Tom's voice was thick with rage and something that might have been fear. "The only explanation they'll understand is strength." But it was Morrison who provided the next shock, his voice hollow with realization. "There's something else you all need to know. About my father's papers." He reached into his vest and pulled out a leather portfolio, its contents yellowed with age. "Found these after he died 2 years ago. Letters from the Dakota and Western Railroad Company, payment receipts, and orders for what they called permanent solution to the Indian problem." Morrison's hands shook as he spread the documents on the desk. My father wasn't just following orders in that massacre. He was being paid to organize it. $500 per confirmed kill with bonuses for eliminating tribal leaders. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Even Tom Brennan seemed stunned by the scope of the conspiracy being revealed. Clara studied the documents, her nursing training helping her parse the cold medical language used to describe mass murder. This isn't just about railroad land, she realized. They were clearing the entire territory. Systematic extermination disguised as frontier justice. Gets worse. Morrison continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The orders came from someone high up in the territorial government, someone with the authority to coordinate multiple incidents across Wyoming and Montana. Tom Brennan's face had gone from flushed to pale. "Jake, you need to put those papers away. Right now." "But why? Because they implicate you deeper than just following orders." Morrison's voice carried a note of desperate accusation. "Tell me you didn't know, Tom. Tell me you thought it was just about protecting settlers." Tom's silence was answer enough. Outside, the war cries had changed in tone, becoming more urgent, more focused. Through the window, Clara could see the Sioux warriors had moved close enough that their face paint was visible in the firelight, elaborate designs that spoke of mourning and preparation for battle. Tall Bear suddenly stepped forward, his rifle still held casually, but his bearing radiating deadly intent. "Enough talking. My uncle came seeking peace, and you murdered him to protect your secrets. The time for words has passed." "Now hold on." Wade interjected, his hand moving to his gun. "Nobody's murdering anybody while I'm—" The arrow took him through the throat before he could finish the sentence. It had come through the window with surgical precision, fired by a warrior who had crept close enough to make the shot impossible to miss. Wade collapsed backward, his eyes wide with surprise, blood frothing from his mouth. The jail erupted into chaos. Keller dove for cover behind the desk, while Morrison scrambled for his rifle. Tom Brennan finally cleared his weapon, but found himself facing not just Tall Bear, but 3 other Sioux warriors who had somehow materialized inside the building. "You move, you die," Tall Bear said calmly, his rifle now aimed directly at Tom's chest. "We came for justice. We came for truth. You have given us neither." Clara found herself pressed against the cell bars, with Sam, her son's body, trembling against hers as violence exploded around them. This was the moment she'd been dreading, when words failed and men resolved their differences with blood. But it was David Brennan who broke the standoff, stepping between his brother and Tall Bear with his hands raised. "Wait," David said, his voice cutting through the tension. "There's something else. Something that changes everything." Tall Bear's dark eyes fixed on him. "Speak quickly, white man. My patience is ended." David reached into his coat, moving slowly to avoid triggering violence. What he withdrew made Clara's breath catch a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "Mikasa gave me this when he died," David said, "along with a message for his people." Tall Bear's expression shifted from anger to something approaching wonder. Clara could see that the pouch meant something significant, perhaps a sacred object or symbol of authority. "Impossible," Tall Bear whispered. "That is the medicine bag of our war chief. He would never give it to—" He said the boy who gave him the apple had shown him that not all white hearts were filled with hatred. David interrupted. "He said his death should not be avenged with more death, but with truth. Justice, yes, but justice that builds instead of destroys." Clara felt tears burning her eyes as she realized what David was saying. Even dying Mikasa had been trying to prevent the cycle of violence from continuing. Tom Brennan was staring at his brother with an expression of complete bewilderment. "David, what are you talking about? You're making it sound like you were actually there when he died." The silence that followed was pregnant with terrible possibility. Clara saw the truth in David's face before he spoke it, and she understood with sickening clarity that the situation was far more complex than anyone had imagined. "I was there, Tom," David said quietly. I was with him when he died. Because I'm the one who shot him. The confession hit the room like a thunderclap. Even Tall Bear seemed stunned, his rifle wavering as he processed what he'd heard. Tom's voice was barely a whisper. I panicked. David continued, his voice gaining strength as he finally unburdened himself of the secret that had been destroying him. When I saw him by the creek that morning, wounded and vulnerable, I thought about the railroad men, about what they'd do if they found out about our meetings. I thought about my own neck, my own future. So I finished what someone else had started. Clara felt the world shifting around her as the implications sank in. If David had killed Wicasa, then who had wounded him in the first place? And why? The answer came from the last person she expected, Sam, whose young voice cut through the adult confusion with devastating clarity. Mr. Brennan, Sam said, looking directly at David. The chief wasn't shot when I found him. He was cut, knife wounds. I seen enough hunting accidents to know the difference. Everyone turned to stare at the boy, and Clara felt a chill of premonition as she realized her son had just identified a crucial lie in David's confession. If he was stabbed, Clara said slowly, then who shot him, and why are you claiming you did? David's face crumpled as his false confession fell apart. Because I thought, I hoped. If I took the blame, maybe the real truth wouldn't have to come out. What real truth? Tall Bear demanded. Before David could answer, another voice spoke from the doorway, cold, authoritative, and utterly without remorse. The truth that some secrets are worth killing to protect. Everyone turned to see a figure silhouetted against the firelight outside. As he stepped into the jail, Clara recognized him as one of the men who'd ridden in with the posse that morning, and the professional gunfighter she'd assumed was just another drifter looking for trouble. But the way Tom Brennan's face went white told her this man was far more than he appeared. Mr. Aldrich, Tom said, his voice barely audible. I thought you'd left town. Did you really think the railroad company would leave such important business in the hands of local incompetents? Aldrich's smile was cold as winter ice. We've been watching this situation develop, Sheriff Brennan. Watching and preparing to clean up whatever mess your family created. Clara realized with growing horror that they weren't just dealing with a cover-up of past crimes, but with an active conspiracy that was willing to kill anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The siege of Bitter Creek wasn't just about justice for Chief Wicasa. It was about preventing the exposure of a systematic campaign of genocide that reached to the highest levels of territorial power. And they were all trapped at the center of it, with killers on both sides of the bars and nowhere left to run. Aldrich stepped fully into the lamplight, and Clara could see he was no ordinary gunfighter. His clothes were expensive, his weapons custom-made, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who killed for profit rather than passion. Behind him, two more men materialized from the shadows, professional killers cut from the same cloth. Gentlemen, Aldrich said conversationally, we have a situation that requires immediate resolution. Too many people know too many things, and the Dakota and Western Railroad Company doesn't appreciate complications. Tom Brennan was staring at the railroad enforcer with the expression of a man watching his worst nightmare come to life. Aldrich, we had an agreement. You said if we kept things quiet. You haven't kept things quiet, Sheriff. You've allowed the situation to spiral completely out of control. Aldrich's voice carried the patience of a teacher explaining something to a slow student. First, your brother starts meeting with hostiles. Then a child witnesses something he shouldn't have. Now we have an entire war party surrounding the town and a jail full of people who know enough to destroy our entire operation. Clara felt Sam press closer against her as the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about covering up a single massacre. It was about protecting an ongoing campaign of extermination that had been happening across the entire territory. The solution is simple, Aldrich continued. The Indians attack the jail. Everyone inside dies heroically defending themselves. End of problems, end of witnesses, end of complications. Tall Bear's rifle swung toward the new threat, but Aldrich's men were already in position. One of them held a shotgun aimed directly at Clara and Sam, while the other had Morrison in his sights. "I wouldn't," Aldrich advised mildly. "My men have very sensitive trigger fingers, and dead hostages serve our purposes just as well as live ones." David Brennan stepped forward, his face twisted with anguish and determination. "You can't just murder everyone. There are limits." "Are there?" Aldrich's laugh was genuinely amused. "Mr. Brennan, we've murdered 17 Indian civilians, including children. We've killed your precious Chief Wicasa when he got too close to the truth. What makes you think we'll hesitate to add a few more bodies to the pile?" Clara's mind raced as she tried to find some way out of the trap closing around them. Outside, the Sioux warriors were still advancing, unaware that the real enemy was already inside the jail. In minutes, they would storm the building, and in the chaos, Aldrich's men could kill everyone and blame it on the Indians. "There's something you don't know," Clara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "About the journal, about the evidence." Aldrich turned his cold gaze on her. "Enlighten me, Mrs. Mackenzie. I didn't just document the massacre. I documented everything that led up to it, including the names and faces of every railroad company representative involved." She was lying, but Aldrich didn't know that. His expression shifted slightly, showing the first crack in his professional composure. More specifically, Clara continued, "I documented you. Your real name, your background, your connections to other massacres across the territory. Kill me, and that information goes to the federal authorities." "Bluffing won't save you, Mrs. Mackenzie. Marie." Clara called to her friend, "Show him the letter." Marie, catching on to Clara's desperate gambit, reached into her coat and withdrew an envelope. "Posted to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver 3 days ago. Full documentation of the railroad company's activities with instructions to open it if anything happens to Clara Mackenzie or her son." Clara could see Aldrich calculating odds, trying to determine if the threat was real. The hesitation gave her the opening she needed. "Sam," she whispered urgently, "when I say run, you head for that back door and don't stop until you're outside." But before she could act, in the front wall of the jail exploded inward in a shower of splinters and flame. Sioux warriors poured through the breach, their war cries filling the air as they engaged Aldrich's men in deadly combat. The jail became a battlefield. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Tom Brennan and his deputies tried to defend themselves against both the Indian attack and Aldrich's betrayal. Clara grabbed Sam and dove for cover behind an overturned desk as bullets whined over their heads. Through the chaos, she saw Tall Bear engaging one of Aldrich's men in hand-to-hand combat, his knife flashing in the lamplight. Morrison had found his rifle and was returning fire, though, whether at the Indians or the railroad killers, Clara couldn't tell. David Brennan was pressed against the wall, Chief Wicasa's medicine bag still clutched in his hands, his face a mask of anguish as the violence he'd tried to prevent exploded around him. But it was Tom Brennan who provided the night's biggest shock. Instead of fighting the Sioux warriors, he turned his gun on Aldrich. "Now this ends now," Tom shouted over the gunfire. "No more killing, no more cover-ups. I'm done being your puppet." Aldrich spun toward him, his own weapon rising, but Tom was faster. The sheriff's shot took the railroad killer center mass, sending him crashing backward into the cell door. The sound of Tom's shot seemed to freeze everyone for a moment. Indians and whites alike turned to stare at the sheriff, who had just turned on his own employers. "It's over," Tom called out, his voice carrying over the dying echoes of gunfire. "The railroad men are dead. We can end this without more bloodshed." Tall Bear emerged from the smoke, his face painted with blood and grime. His dark eyes found Tom Brennan, and for a moment the two men stared at each other across the wreckage of the jail. "You killed the one who ordered my uncle's death," Tall Bear said quietly. I killed the one who was going to murder innocents to protect his secrets, Tom replied. Same as your uncle would have done. Clara could see the young warrior weighing Tom's words, trying to decide whether this was justice or simply another white man's lie. The decision he made would determine whether the violence continued or whether there was still hope for peace. Outside, she could hear more warriors arriving, with their voices raised in question as they found their comrades standing among armed white men without fighting. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Then Sam did something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Her 11-year-old son stood up from behind their cover, walked calmly to where Chief Wikasa's medicine bag lay near David's feet, and picked it up. This belonged to the man I gave my apple to. Sam said, his young voice clear in the sudden quiet. He was hurt and scared, but he didn't hurt me. He said something in his language that sounded like, "Thank you." I think he'd want his people and my people to stop hurting each other. Sam walked across the blood-stained floor and held out the medicine bag to Tall Bear. The warrior stared down at the boy for a long moment, then slowly reached out to accept the sacred object. Your uncle was right, Sam continued. Understanding is stronger than hatred, but it only works if people choose it. Tall Bear knelt to bring himself to Sam's eye level, his fierce expression softening as he looked into the child's earnest face. Faust, you speak with wisdom beyond your years, little brother, Tall Bear said. My uncle's spirit smiles to hear such words from one so young. He stood and addressed the room, his voice carrying the authority of his position as war chief. My people came seeking justice for my uncle's murder and for the massacre of our innocent ones. We have found both justice and truth in this place. The debt is balanced. Tom Brennan stepped forward, his gun holstered, his hands empty. What happens now between your people and mine? Tall Bear considered the question carefully. Now we choose whether to build on the foundation of truth or let the old hatreds poison another generation. My uncle believed understanding was possible. Perhaps it is time to prove him right. As the immediate crisis passed, Clara felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her. They had survived the night, but the real work was just beginning. The truth about the massacre was out. The railroad conspiracy was exposed, and the cycle of violence had been broken, at least for now. But she also knew that healing the wounds between peoples would take more than one night of choosing peace over war. It would take years of patient work of building trust, one conversation at a time, of raising children who saw enemies as potential friends. Looking at her son standing between Sioux warriors and white settlers, Clara felt a flicker of hope that perhaps such healing was possible after all. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek like a cautious animal, sending pale light through the smoke and wreckage of the night's violence. Clara stood in the doorway of the destroyed jail, watching as Sioux warriors and white townspeople worked together to tend the wounded and bury the dead. The transformation was remarkable and fragile. Men who had been shooting at each other hours earlier now shared water and bandages, united by the exhaustion that followed, survived violence, and the recognition that they were all simply human beings trying to live in a harsh land. Captain Richards of the 7th Cavalry had arrived at sunrise with a full company expecting to find a massacre. Instead, he discovered something unprecedented, a treaty being negotiated in the ruins of a jail between a Sioux war chief and a frontier sheriff who had chosen justice over self-preservation. Mrs. Mackenzie. Richards approached her, his young face showing the confusion of a military officer confronting a situation that existed outside his training. I need to understand what happened here. My orders were to suppress an Indian uprising, but what I'm seeing doesn't match any uprising I've encountered. Clara gestured toward where Tom Brennan sat with Tall Bear and several tribal elders, the men speaking in a mixture of English and Lakota, as they worked through the complex negotiations required to prevent future violence. There was no uprising, Captain. There was justice. Sometimes they look the same from a distance, but they're very different things. Richard studied the scene with the careful attention of someone trying to write a report that wouldn't get him court-martialed. The territorial governor isn't going to be pleased. He was expecting a decisive military victory to boost his political prospects. The territorial governor was being paid by the same railroad company that ordered the original massacre. Clara replied bluntly, "I suspect his displeasure is the least of his problems once the federal investigators arrive." Morrison approached them, his face haggard but determined. In his hands, he carried his father's correspondence, along with documents recovered from Aldrich's body. "Mrs. Mackenzie, Captain Richards." Morrison said formally, "I want to make a full confession to the territorial authorities. Everything my father did, everyone he worked with, every dollar he was paid to murder innocent people." Richards accepted the papers with the grim resignation of an officer who realized his simple military mission had become a complex political investigation. "Deputy Morrison, I'll need you to accompany me to Fort Laramie for formal testimony." "I understand, sir. It's past time the truth came out." As Morrison walked away to gather his belongings, Clara found herself thinking about the courage it took to expose one's own family secrets. The deputy could have burned his father's papers and lived with the knowledge quietly, but instead, he had chosen to honor the dead by seeking justice for them. David Brennan appeared at her elbow, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. Chief Wikasa's medicine bag hung around his neck, a gift from Tall Bear in recognition of his attempts to prevent further bloodshed. "Clara," David said quietly, "I need to tell you something about that night 5 years ago." "You don't need to tell me anything, David. The past is the past." "No, it's not. Not until I say this." David's voice carried the weight of years of guilt. "I could have stopped it. When I learned what Tom and the others were planning, I could have ridden to the Indian camp and warned them. I chose not to, and 17 people died because of my cowardice." Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw not the broken man she'd known, but someone struggling to rebuild himself from the ruins of his mistakes. "David, what matters isn't what you didn't do 5 years ago. What matters is what you choose to do now. I want to help, with whatever comes next. Building bridges between the communities, making sure this kind of thing never happens again." Clara nodded. "That's good. We'll need people who understand both sides, who can translate more than just languages." Through the morning bustle, she spotted Sam talking with several Sioux children who had come with their families to witness the negotiations. Despite the language barrier, they seemed to be communicating perfectly through the universal language of childhood curiosity and shared games. Marie Dumont joined Clara in watching the children play. "Your son has a gift," Marie observed. "He sees people as people, not as members of opposing tribes. He gets that from his father. John always said that most problems came from people forgetting that their enemies were human too. The boy will need that gift in the years to come. This peace we're building, it's fragile. It will take constant tending." Clara understood what Marie was saying. The events of the past day had broken the cycle of violence, but building lasting peace would require the work of generations. Children like Sam, who had seen through hatred to the humanity beneath, would be the ones to carry that work forward. Tom Brennan approached them, his sheriff's badge conspicuously absent from his shirt. His face showed the exhaustion of a man who had looked into his own soul and found it wanting, but also the relief of someone who had finally chosen the right path. "Clara," Tom said, "I wanted to thank you for having the courage to document what really happened 5 years ago. If you hadn't kept that journal, the truth might never have come out. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, Tom. I just helped it along. I know I don't deserve forgiveness for what I did for the people I let die. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends." Clara studied the man who had been both protector and threat, who had participated in massacre but also chosen justice when it mattered most. "Tom, forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you choose to accept. The question is whether you can forgive yourself enough to do the work that needs doing. As the morning progressed, Clara watched the complex negotiations taking shape. Land rights, water access, compensation for past wrongs, mechanisms for resolving future disputes are the practical details that would determine whether this fragile peace could become something lasting. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, misunderstandings, people on both sides who preferred the simplicity of hatred to the complexity of coexistence. But for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Clara felt hope that her son might inherit a world slightly better than the one she had known. The apple Sam had given to Chief Wicasa had been consumed long ago, but its meaning lived on in the conversations happening around her, in the children playing together, despite their different languages, in the adults choosing to see each other as neighbors rather than enemies. Sometimes Clara reflected the smallest acts of kindness cast the longest shadows. 6 months later, Clara stood beside a granite monument on the hill overlooking Bitter Creek, reading the inscription carved in both English and Lakota. The stone listed the names of the 17 Sioux civilians murdered in the winter of 1878, but it also bore the name of Chief Wicasa and a simple message: they died seeking understanding. Let us live proving it possible. Sam knelt beside the memorial, placing a fresh red apple at its base, a ritual he had maintained every week since the monument's dedication. At 12 now, he had grown taller and more serious, but his eyes still held the compassion that had moved him to help a wounded stranger. Sam said, standing and brushing dirt from his knees, "Do you think Chief Wicasa would be proud of what's happened?" Clara considered the question as she looked out over the transformed community below. Bitter Creek had become something unprecedented in the Wyoming Territory, a place where Sioux families lived and worked alongside white settlers, where disputes were settled through negotiation rather than violence, where children grew up speaking multiple languages and seeing diversity as strength rather than threat. The changes hadn't come without struggle. Some families had left rather than accept the new reality, and there were still those who muttered about Indian lovers and bleeding heart liberals. But they were outnumbered now by people who had seen what hatred could accomplish and wanted no part of it. "I think Chief Wicasa would be proud of you, Sam. You showed courage when it mattered most, not the kind that comes from a gun, but the kind that comes from the heart." Footsteps on the path announced other visitors. Tall Bear approached with his wife and young daughter carrying flowers picked from the prairie grass. The warrior had become the unofficial liaison between the Sioux community and the town council, his fluent English and diplomatic skills helping to bridge cultural gaps. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Tall Bear said formally, "I bring greetings from my grandmother. She wishes to see you when you have time." "Of course. How is she doing?" "Well, but growing thoughtful in her old age. She speaks often of the night you chose truth over safety. She says such choices echo through generations." As Tall Bear's family paid their respects at the monument, Clara reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night 6 months ago. Tom Brennan had resigned as sheriff and was now working as a mediator for territorial disputes involving Native Americans. His knowledge of both sides' grievances made him uniquely valuable in preventing future conflicts. David Brennan had surprised everyone by becoming a teacher working with both Sioux and white children to create an educational program that honored both cultures while preparing young people for an increasingly complex world. Morrison had testified before a federal grand jury, his evidence leading to the prosecution of numerous railroad officials and territorial politicians. The scandal had reached all the way to Washington, resulting in significant reforms in how the government dealt with Native American tribes. Marie Dumont had been elected mayor of Bitter Creek, becoming the first person of mixed heritage to hold such a position in Wyoming territory. Her husband, Pierre, had established a successful trading post that served both communities, fostering economic cooperation that was slowly building into genuine friendship. "Mrs. Mackenzie," a new voice called from the path below, Clara turned to see Captain Richards approaching now, wearing civilian clothes and looking far more relaxed than during their first meeting. He had resigned from the cavalry to work as a federal investigator specializing in cases involving conflicts between settlers and Native Americans. Mr. Richards, what brings you back to Bitter Creek? On official business, I'm afraid. But good news this time. Richards pulled out a thick envelope marked with federal seals. The Department of the Interior has approved the land grant we discussed. The Sioux Band will have permanent title to the Winter Valley, where the massacre occurred, along with water rights and hunting privileges. Tall Bear accepted the documents with visible emotion. This means our children will be able to visit the graves of their ancestors, to remember the stories that must not be forgotten. It also means, Richards added, that the federal government officially acknowledges that a crime was committed against your people, and that justice was not served at the time. Clara felt tears burning her eyes as she realized the full significance of what was happening. It wasn't just about land or water rights. It was about recognition, acknowledgement. The official admission that the Sioux victims had been human beings deserving of justice rather than obstacles to be removed. As the formal ceremony concluded and the various officials departed, Clara found herself alone with Sam on the hill. The sun was setting over the Wyoming plains, painting the endless grass in shades of gold and crimson. "Sam," she said, "I want you to remember something important. What you did by that creek offering food to a wounded stranger that took more courage than any gunfighter ever showed. Real courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid." Sam nodded solemnly. "I was scared, Ma. But he looked so hurt, and I had this apple. And that apple changed everything. Not because it was magic, but because it represented a choice. The choice to see others as human beings deserving of compassion rather than as enemies to be feared." As night settled over the territory, Clara could see lights beginning to twinkle in the windows of Bitter Creek. Some belonged to families who had lived there for years, while others belonged to Sioux families who had recently moved to participate in the new cooperative ventures. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still prejudices to overcome, still the daily work of building trust between peoples who had been taught to see each other as threats. But it was a beginning, and sometimes a beginning was enough. That night, as Clara tucked Sam into bed, he asked the question she had been expecting. "Ma, do you think we'll stay here in Bitter Creek?" Clara looked out the window at the community they had helped to build at the monument on the hill that honored both the dead and the living, at the future that stretched before them, like an unwritten story. "I think, Sam, that we've found our home. Not just a place to live, but a community worth building, worth fighting for, worth the hard work of making it better every day." Sam smiled and closed his eyes. And Clara realized that for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, she felt truly at peace. The past had been acknowledged, justice had been served, and the future held the promise of children who would grow up knowing that difference didn't have to mean enmity. The apple had been consumed long ago, but its meaning lived on in the integrated schools, the joint trading ventures, the marriages between young people from different communities, and most importantly, in the children who were learning that courage looked like kindness, and kindness could change the world. As Clara prepared for sleep, she felt Chief Wikasa's presence in the room not as a ghost or spirit, but as a living reminder that understanding was indeed stronger than hatred if people had the courage to choose it. Outside her window, Wyoming stretched endlessly under the stars, vast and unforgiving, but no longer empty of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose compassion over fear, justice over expedience, bridge building over wall building. But tonight, in a small town, where former enemies had become neighbors, where a boy's simple act of kindness had grown into a community's commitment to peace, Clara Mackenzie slept peacefully, knowing that some stories do have happy endings, especially the ones written by people brave enough to believe that change is possible one apple at a time. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its voice carrying across the plains like a song of the new West being born. Wild, still, dangerous, still, but no longer hopeless, no longer defined solely by violence and hatred. The age of understanding had begun, and it had started with an 11-year-old boy who saw a fellow human being in need and chose to help, setting in motion a chain of events that proved once and for all that the smallest acts of courage cast the longest shadows.